Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In October this year, Australians will be asked whether we want to change our constitution to establish an Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander voice. Now, the history of Indigenous Australia since white settlement in the late 18th century has been marked by much tragedy and suffering, and the progress to improve Indigenous disadvantage has been all too slow. Joining me to discuss all these issues is Bundjalung man and Indigenous leader Warren Mundine. It's great to have you on Afternoon Light, Warren.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And it's great to have you here in Melbourne. You're no doubt shivering in the dying days of our winter, but braving it all so well.
Well, I must be acclimatising. I've been down here so often now. I've just got a jacket and a T-shirt on.
No, you look quite underdressed. But Warren, I thought before we get stuck into the real kind of issues that are gripping the nation today and the history that underpins the story of how we got there, is just to ask you about your own story. How did you get to where you are today? You have been on an incredible journey.
Yeah, and also a journey that I didn't plan. You know, I remember I taught a year 10 class about 10 years ago, and one of the kids asked me afterwards, he said, what was your plan from working in a factory at 16 and then going to be president of the Labor Party? And I thought that was an incredible question, because I thought about it, because I've never been asked that before. And I said, well, it wasn't really a plan, because if my parents found out I wanted to go from Fitter and Turner to a president of the Labor Party, they probably would have locked me up in a mental institution at a very young age. So what it was is, it's a bit of a cliche. I always look at things and I think about things and read about it, and then I say, I can do that. So then I do it, and then I'd get on top of the hill and I see another hill, and I go, I wonder if I can do that too. So it was sort of like a stumbling process, and here I am.
But your mother was Irish and your father was an Aboriginal man.
No, she was half Aboriginal. It was her
grandfather was Irish. Apologies. Yes.
That's right. They're Donovans. We call them Donovans in our family.
Yeah.
Donovans, people outside call it, except in Ireland. And I went to Ireland to follow up where my great-grandfather come from, and they called it Donovan over there as well.
Oh,
so
there you go.
I thought it was just an Aboriginal way of saying it, but no, it turns out it's Irish.
Yeah. And so the Irish identity, did that colour some of your upbringing at all, or were you pretty much raised as an Aboriginal boy?
It was a bit of both, because that's through my mother we got our Catholicism, and my mum and my grandparents that were very, very strong Catholics. And so, yes, that had a big influence on us. But at the same time, my father, he come from a very Aboriginal family in that he grew up living in a hump and almost traditional type lifestyle. And of course, when he married my mother in the 1939, 1940, the rules were for the Catholic Church was that if you wanted to marry a Catholic, then you had to convert in those days. And he wasn't particularly religious, and so he sort of went, that's okay, that'll do, type bloke. And then, of course, later on, got the old saying that there's nothing worse than a convert, because he became very Catholic after that, several years later, after he came back from the Second World War. And he used to hang around with the priest and used to do jobs. And in fact, when my boys went to St. Joey's College in Sydney, in Hunters Hill, my dad pointed out that the year 10 building, he worked on that as a volunteer to help build that.
Aww.
Because he knew the headmaster at the time. So that was quite interesting. He used to St. Gregory's Agricultural College. He went out there, and because he's a grader driver, he helped build the roads and that around that campus and stuff. So, yeah, and of course his favourite old mate, Father McGovern, he used to go up there and have a few ales with him after the Mass and that. So, yeah.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, and when they died, my mother had 2 archbishops and 5 bishops and about 11 or 12, probably 20 priests to a funeral. And my father, he had a couple of archbishops and similar size group. Yeah.
Wow, what a legacy. So you attended Catholic schools in your childhood. And did you get involved in politics early on, or were your parents political?
They were, but not in a formal sense. Like my father, he used to clean the table down after the dinner, and he'd have these debates, because I'm number 9 of 11 siblings,
Good Catholic family.
Yeah, very Catholic. You know, we've got to breed priests and nuns, and the rest of us have got to keep breeding. And and then they'd have discussions with my older siblings. I was only young. I used to sit there and just listen about what was happening that day, what the politics were and stuff like that. And they were very strong Catholics. And of course, things that you don't hear of today, like with the Menzies government funding Catholic schools, and then you had dogs, what they called dogs. Defence of Government Schools was a political party in those days, and as my father was very much against them and thought Menzies did a good job in regard to getting funding for Catholic schools.
Were they fans of Menzies? Do you remember?
Yes and no, because my father was a Labor man, old-fashioned Labor man. In those days, Catholics were very much in the church until they had the breakaway with the DLP, the Democratic Labor Party, which was more Catholic now. But in New South Wales, that didn't happen. In Victoria and Queensland, it did. But in New South Wales, the Archbishop at the time, he asked the Catholics to stay in the Labor Party. So it's interesting because the right wing of the Labor Party in New South Wales could almost sit in the Liberal Party, because I had a friend of mine, Carpenter, he was the Premier of Western Australia. He thought he was a right-winger until he come to New South Wales, and then he realised he was a left-winger because the right wing was very Catholic and very conservative in New South Wales.
Yeah, so they didn't really talk much about B.A. Santa Maria, I guess, because he was sort of considered more of a Victorian identity, or?
No, my dad used to put his TV show on every morning, the black and white TV, and not every morning, but on the weekend, and we'd sit down and listen to him.
Did they talk about communism? Because obviously B.A. Santa Maria was incredibly concerned about communism.
They were very anti-communist. And of course, at the same time, from my memory, Bob Santa Maria was in the 60s, of course, was, as a kid, he was very much pro the Vietnam War. And of course, at that time, I had a brother, and my older brother's 20 years older than me, a brother and several cousins and a brother-in-law who are all Aboriginals, and they all were serving in Vietnam at the time. So we were very much concerned about their safety and stuff like that, and also very much pro the Vietnamese War. And it's interesting because a lot of the South was Catholic as well, South Vietnam, and this is where you see the Catholic Church now. A lot of the priests are actually Vietnamese. And so they were concerned about that. And also my brother, he fought in the Confrontage as well, which no one remembers really. Because
we do here at the Robert Menzies Institute, Warren.
He was in that war. He actually got shot in the leg in the Confrontage. Yeah, so he was served quite a lot.
Yeah. Oh, that's an incredible contribution and sacrifice your family's made for the defence of Australia and defence of Australian values too abroad.
Well, I had also an uncle, and my mother's brother, he served in the Korean War and that as well, and of course my father and that in the Second World War.
Yeah. So, Warren, last week you gave an address here at Melbourne University on a forgotten legacy, the Menzies government's policy when it came to Indigenous affairs. And I mean, your speech was incredible. I learned so much. I often think I know quite a bit about the Menzies era, but you really did uncover some fascinating policies and facts that I think deserve much more attention than we get today. And I always say, with wherever we are in contemporary debates and crossroads, and Australia is at a crossroad at the moment when it comes to recognition of Indigenous people in our constitution and how we do that, how did we get to this point? And I'd love to hear what you think was the achievements of the Menzies government when it came to Indigenous affairs. What are the things that really stand out for you?
Well, the big standouts for me, even when I was in the Labor Party, I recognised the work that the Menzies era did, especially with voting rights. And couldn't be in a liberal democracy, there couldn't be anything more important than voting rights. And, of course, the 67 referendum and the setting up of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which IATSIS was one of the world-renowned places for research. And, of course, AB studies, and I always knew about them things. So when I approached you, and I thought it would be a good idea to give a talk about it, because everyone used to challenge me. They said, well, you left the Labor Party and you joined the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party's done nothing for Aboriginals. And I said, well, that's not true. So I had those comments. And then I noticed that a lot of members, especially young members of the Liberal Party, didn't know about their own history of Indigenous affairs. So then I decided to change that, because the left have been, not only the Labor Party, but the Greens and everyone else have been able to put us in a box that we didn't do anything for Aboriginal people, and were all a bunch of rednecks. And I found that quite interesting, seeing that the first Aboriginal in Parliament was from the Liberal Party.
Yeah, Neville Bonner.
From Queensland too.
Yes, of all places.
Of all places. It'd be the equivalent of African-American Republicans coming from Georgia.
Yeah.
So it was quite an interest. So I decided to go into it. I tried to get you, and you were very opening to having that discussion. And so we worked it out and did it. But the amazing thing was, you've learned a lot, but I learned whole lot more, and how far it went back. I was only just looking at the Menzies era from the 1949 right through to 1965. But I found out why these men, and it was men, how do they get these ideas and where do they come from? So going back and looking into the 1930s and seeing how their thoughts and everything come together. And of course the 1930s on an international stage was the building up for the Second World War, and you saw the racial hatred and the anti-Semitism that was happening at the time. So these people were ahead of their times. Another interesting thing that I don't know if you would know, but Menzies' driver, it was an Aboriginal man. And he used to stay at the lodge and everything like that, and was very, very close with the family.
Yeah.
So I didn't actually know that. You're ahead of me on that one, Georgia. And it was amazing to see that. And of course, which I didn't mention in my talk, and I'll slip it in there and pretend I did. So this idea that they were these old, fuddy, colonial type people was only part of their story. The big part of their story was their reform agenda and how they were going to make Australia this great nation economically on the world stage, and also deal with its internal issues, the problems that were here. You look at Sir Paul Hasluck, I reckon there should be a statue of him somewhere, but then they might pull it down. But anyway.
You've got to be careful with statues.
You've got to be careful with statues. And because in the 1930s, a journalist with the West Australian newspaper, and he was very heavily involved in Aboriginal interest in Western Australia, which is really amazing because Western Australia was one of those states had taken away voting rights for Aboriginals. And so he was a real champion for Aboriginal people in the 1930s.
Yeah, the story of Sir Paul Hasluck, who ends up becoming Australia's Governor-General, of course, but was Menzies' Minister for Territories, is an extraordinary one. And I know you spoke about this in your talk last week, but to understand this young man going to university, and he would have been an ambitious type of guy. He ends up in politics, he's interested in journalism, but he decides to study Aboriginal studies, which is almost unheard of in terms of academic inquiry back in the 1930s.
Yeah, you probably could count on one hand.
I think so. And he does this master's thesis on Aboriginal affairs policy in Western Australia, and then publishes it into a book in 1942 called Black Australians. And it was basically an attack on the paternalistic sort of protective policies where, we know, white people know best, let's take away black children and, all the stolen generation sort of tragedy that we know so well, and that policies for Indigenous people should be focused on equality.
Yes.
And while that may be criticised these days as assimilationist policy that doesn't understand the importance of Indigenous culture and identity and connection to land, it certainly was progress. And that is something I think that when you look at the Menzies era from sort of Hasluck onwards is, okay, they didn't have all the answers then. They were in a context, but it was a progression.
It was a foundation. I'd say not just a progression, it was a foundation that today we still hear the echoes of that and look and how we look back and how we want to improve things. And it was very much in line with the time, because people talk about the day of mourning, which was in 1938 on Australia Day, when all the premiers and ministers come to meet in Sydney at the time, Jack Patton and Bill Ferguson and William Cooper and that. They were these leaders of the civil rights movement. They're our equivalent of Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And they, on that day, everyone become mythical in many sense about what they were doing. But when you go back and actually go through the research in the papers and that, they were asking for full citizenship. They were citizens of Australia. A lot of people don't quite understand this because they were British. Everyone who was British subjects were citizens of Australia. The citizenship officially would come in 1948.
Yes.
And so they had citizenship, but they were sort of second-class citizens because they were, and it wasn't because of the federal government, it was because of the state governments. They had the Aboriginal Protection Acts, which started out as good ideas in that because Aboriginals were being forced off their land and that, so they wanted to look after them, but it all then turned almost into a control factor of Aboriginal people's life. So they wanted full citizenship and they wanted to be treated equal. And that's what part of their 10-point plan was for that to happen. And they wanted equal opportunities in education and getting houses and doing their own thing. So that fitted really well with Sir Robert Menzies and Sir Paul Hasluck were trying to achieve. They wanted Aboriginals to be equal as citizens and that. And they're the people who did that. They built this amazing foundation where we are seeing some of the arguments and debates and everything about today, the continuation of that. So what they did and what they achieved, to me, is going to echo through history.
What Paul Hasluck as Territories Minister in the Menzies government did in Northern Territory is fascinating, and it's a story that has not really been told. And, I mean, I think it's worth sort of reflecting on it. So he's able, through obviously the Commonwealth's power over the territories, to use it as an example, as almost an experiment to try and drive this agenda of equality, whereas in the states each state was responsible for Indigenous people and the different policies, and there were a range of conditions, some worse than others. But introducing a welfare ordinance into the territory, removing race-based protective legislation, giving Aboriginal people legal equality, Hasluck's establishing a Native Welfare Council, and really coordinating that federal territory cooperation when it came to Aboriginal people. But it's interesting, later in life, Hasluck does reflect on the fact that he had assumed Indigenous people would seek to be more part of mainstream culture than they perhaps wanted to be in reality, and he hadn't quite appreciated their sort of strong spiritual and cultural connections and their customary land ties. Can you reflect on that as an Aboriginal man?
Yes, well, I look at what he achieved. And of course, he was the Minister for Territories and he had the big drive for that to happen. He had to have the support of the Cabinet and the leader, Sir Robert Menzies. And so they worked as a really good team. And because of the Constitution prior to 1967, the only area that the federal government, the Commonwealth government, had real power in Aboriginal affairs was in the Northern Territory. And so for him, it was almost like an experiment about his ideas and getting these things to happen and that. So it's a bit ironic that the most traditional Aboriginal cultural place, the Northern Territories, was where this was going to be played out. And so he did some really great work. The stuff they did there was able to be used to beat up the states about and say, hey, come on, you've got to start treating people equal. You've got to start treating like all other Australians and or other New South Welshmen or women or Queenslanders or whatever. And so that gave them the oomph to do these things. And also the time, also, you've got to have timing as well. It's post-Second World War. It's post-decolonising the world. And so you're getting countries in Africa and West Indies and South Pacific and all that in Asia and that as well, getting independence. So they come very much together. And he was able to use that at one of the native welfare meetings, and that he actually spoke about that we need as a nation to move forward and open our hearts about making Aboriginal people equal to everyone else in our society. And he talked about South Africa, he talked about the apartheid system in South Africa, and he talked about other areas. And he said, if we're going to play our part in a global society, then we have to do these things. Now, he used those type of language, but he also believed in it. It wasn't a political thing for him. He used the politics to shift some of the states. Like Queensland was a good example. They held out right to the very end before they gave Aboriginal people full voting rights and equality. And it's really bizarre that it turned out to be the first state that got Aboriginals and Senator Neville Bonner into the federal parliament. And also they got the first Aboriginal, it was the second Aboriginal, into a state parliament, and that was Eric Durrell from North Queensland. He was in 1974, so 3 years after Senator Neville Bonner. So it's interesting to see that change coming in that state. And it was, he was a man of his time. I always say that looking back in history and that, you shouldn't look back through your own lenses. You should try and understand. In fact, I went to Mara School, and my religious teacher, Brother John Moles, he was a man like that, because when you're a young teenager and that, you always question everything. So we questioned him about the Catholic Church and why the rules were. And he said, well, you've got to take your place in that time. And what they were facing in that time, and how they were going to overcome things. And then you'll have a better understanding of why this rule was put in place.
Well, and I always say, don't feel so smug today, because imagine in 100 years' time, people looking back at, Warren and Georgina and how shocking we were in our views.
Right. Yeah,
they're not up with 21, 23 views. So, it's
You're correct. And so that helped me in my life growth as well, because I always looked at people and try and understand where they're coming from, because you get some migrant people coming here and you're trying to understand the pain they went through, the success they went through, and all that type of stuff, and why they come to Australia. Some escaping the horrors of the Second World War, and other ones coming here for they wanted a better life for their children and grandchildren and that. So that's what I focus on. So with them, they were men of their times.
Sure.
And you've got to accept that. And so Paul Hasluck, he didn't quite understand that quite strong personal relationship that Aboriginal people have with land, especially in the Northern Territory and Northern Australia, where they've still got very strong traditional societies and that. And he sort of struggled with that in regard to that they didn't fully take on what he was trying to do. He'd be a lot more happier today because, you look at the Northern Territory and you look at some of these successful Aboriginal communities and Northern Australia where they run mines, they have companies, they've got businesses. 7,000 Aboriginals work in the mining industry and 2,500 businesses, Aboriginal businesses work in the mining and energy industry and that. And you see that change that come. You've got doctors and other people who come through that system. And of course, the thing they didn't quite understand is that you can retain your beliefs and your culture, but you still can be a doctor and you still can be a lawyer and you can still be a member of parliament.
Yeah, or work in a mine or run a tourist operation.
Or whatever. Yeah. They were successful in that, we're looking at the society that we have today. The 67 referendum with Aboriginals fought for that equality and won. That working with people like, Sir Robert Menzies and Sir Paul Hasluck and also Harold Holt, who held that referendum.
So the 67 referendum was obviously a key moment in Australian history when it comes to our relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But a lot of people will say, the 67 referendum, that's when Aborigines got the vote in Australia. But of course, that's not true.
Correct.
That was 1962, Menzies era legislation to...
Oh, that's at a federal level. To other federal level. Other people got to understand that it was Queensland and Western Australia, they took away the voting rights in the 1890s from Aboriginals. In New South Wales, we've always had the voting right. In fact, I got evidence when I wrote my book, evidence of my grandfather in 1913 voting. He was on the electoral roll. And then you see South Australia, Aboriginal women, because South Australia was the first state to give women the vote, they were voting in 1896. So this idea of that we didn't have voting rights, people needed, I always say it was the time and the geography. So if you're in Queensland, you missed out. If you're in New South Wales or South Australia, Victoria, something, you got it.
Can you tell me what was the impact of the 1962 change to the Federal Electoral Act to enable Aboriginal people to vote in federal elections? Because it had an influence on the states that were holding out, giving Aboriginal people a vote.
Yeah, on two levels. One is the administrative level, because all of a sudden Aboriginals could vote in the federal elections, and that meant you have two books. You had to have a book for the federal elections and a book for the state elections. And then on the other level, it was a very strong, more than a symbol, a very strong actual thing that forced the states to really look at themselves and actually change. Western Australia is a bit quicker than Queensland because they did it not long after the federal government did. And then, of course, Queensland didn't do it till 1965. So, yeah.
And so in that period, you also have the lead up to the 67 referendum. I mean, and that's not something that comes out of a vacuum.
No.
Australians are working towards that. The Menzies government is working towards it. And in that context too, you have, of course, and you mentioned this earlier, the development of IATSIS, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, as it becomes known a bit later. I mean, that was revolutionary, developing that. The Conference on Australian Aboriginal Studies that W.E.H. Stanner, the anthropologist, had convened, and Bill Wentworth, who was a Liberal MP, a bit of a...
Interesting bloke, I think.
Yeah, an interesting bloke. He was a real proponent of the establishment of IATSIS. And all this was happening in the Menzies era. And the work of IATSIS in collecting, for example, what are now lost Indigenous languages, recording them, and these are things that if IATSIS hadn't existed, we would not have preserved these language groups.
Can I give you a very personal thing? My father's older brother, Uncle Richard, I never knew this man. He passed away before I was born, but the family spoke about him. He was a very much traditional bloke. He spoke his language. He was a Christian still at the same time as being an Aboriginal cultural man. And I went down to Canberra, it would have been 2008, and a friend of mine there, he called me aside and he said, look, I've got something that you'd really appreciate. So he took me into the sound room there and he put on this tape. And on this tape, which was done in the late 40s, is my Uncle Richard. He's talking in English and then he's talking in language and he's explaining the language. And I sat in that booth for hours.
Wow.
And just listening to this man. And he was also very strong in the civil rights movement and that as well. And so that wouldn't have happened if IATSIS wasn't set up. So it was this group of people who come together, and these academics and researchers and stuff working with the political arm of the day, the Menzies government, who made it, who made that happen. And we are seeing the fruits of that, because in New South Wales today, there's 5,000 Aboriginal kids who are learning their language, which was dead really, from listening to their tapes, getting the books out of that IATSIS area. And so it's a marvellous, marvellous, incredible thing that IATSIS has become.
It is. It's a really important institution that was established at a time when I think Australians wouldn't have expected it to be. They might think, oh, this was an organisation from the 80s when things were getting going, but actually it's been around.
Well, people were telling me that, Gough Whitlam did this, Gough Whitlam did that. And look, I'm a very strong believer in history and learning about history. And in fact, even my economics, my business stuff, I use history in regard to that. And I don't know what kids have been taught today. And in fact, I hear where people sort of not learning history and that now these days. I don't know how you can build and work a society and make a society better without knowing your history.
So speaking of history, the 67 referendum was incredibly important. I mean, Menzies is Prime Minister until January 1966, and he was in 1965 very much pushing for and actually passed legislation to hold the referendum to deal with the nexus issue, so enabling the increase of numbers of MPs in the House of Representatives without the connection to the Senate, and that actually ends up failing, and we still have that problem. And also...
It was a pity.
Yes. And also he wanted to remove Section 127 of the Constitution that said, in reckoning the numbers of people of the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. So those were the two changes Menzies wanted to see. But he, as I said, he resigns and retires from politics in January 1966, so leaves the referendum to his successor, Harold Holt. And Harold Holt takes a slightly different view. He agrees with those two proposals, but he also wants a change to Section 51(26) of the Constitution, and that would allow basically the federal government to be able to create policies in the states in relation to Aboriginal people, not just the territories which it had been. It's interesting, Menzies was opposed to that because he wanted the race power completely removed from the Constitution. Correct. But Harold Holt took a different view, which is the view we live with today.
Yeah. This is where you have this misunderstanding of history. People look at Sir Robert Menzies' opposition to that clause, and they say, look, that just proves that he was racist. In actual fact, it wasn't. He wanted race totally removed from the Constitution. And this is one of my arguments today. I look around the world and I see countries that had race within their constitution or still have race within their constitutions, and they were a disaster. You look at Fiji. Fiji took race out of their constitution. because they ended up having 3 or 4 coups and fighting over it and divided the country. So I believe Menzies was right. The argument was by having race in there by Harold Holt, and then having the other section, which escapes me at the moment, which is about if 2 laws clash, then the Commonwealth law overrides that.
I think it's Section 109, from memory.
No, I think you're a lawyer now, so I'll take your word for that.
We'll be deleting this bit of the podcast if I'm wrong.
And you'll be put another voice saying what section, because he was thinking about overriding all these state protection laws, which still, even though we had citizenship, still restricted us in the states and territories, because people forget that we're a federation. We're like the United States, federation states, sovereign just as much as the Commonwealth is, and so you have to work together as a team. So using that, he was able to force the states, the resistant states, most states were all on board, and within 4 or 5 years, all those laws disappeared. All the discriminatory laws against Aboriginals disappeared. It was gone. And we were then able to be really full citizens then.
There's an argument, I mean, maybe this is a question for constitutional lawyers, but there's an argument that if we didn't have the race power, if Menzies had got his way and taken race entirely out of the Constitution, then the federal government wouldn't have been able to pass legislation like native title and land rights. And then, of course, there are policies that are...
Aboriginal education policies.
That's right, ab study, things like that. So it cuts both ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to pretend I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm not even a bush lawyer. From my observation and learning over the last 100 years of my life, I think there is an argument both ways, not coming from me as a non-lawyer. I think there is an argument from that because I trust the legal arguments back and forwards. And then I actually thought, but even if they took it out, the Commonwealth could still make laws in regard to this area. Because there's 2 bases for that. One, which I turned out to be wrong on, was the United States. They still make laws in regard, but I didn't realise that they had all these treaties, which when the United States was set up in independence, that those treaties carried on, and therefore they use them in regard to their Native Americans and how they operate. Same with Canada. Canada does the same thing, and also New Zealand does the same thing. So I was wrong in that approach. So of course, we didn't have treaties and everything. We needed something there. And so I don't really understand it all, but I'll accept those arguments.
So, Warren, talk of treaties, it brings me on to the present day. At the moment, you're engaged in a campaign against this proposal to change the Constitution to establish Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. There are obviously passionate voices on the yes side, passionate voices on the no side. This idea comes from the Uluru Statement from the Heart and many decades of work towards this, where there is a proposal for the voice, but also truth-telling and treaty-making. Before we go to the voice, tell me, you have a particular view on treaties in Australia with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
This is where I am.
Part company?
No, we don't part company. This is where I find the Prime Minister's stance.
Yeah.
I find it cowardice because he thinks the Australian people are stupid in that the voice and the treaty stuff is separate. No, he said on winning the election in 2022, and he's said it 38 times since, that he was going to put the full force of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which includes treaty. So then he starts sort of wobbling on the politics. I think that's cowardice. If he really believes in that, he should prosecute his case. I'm a great person who believes in prosecuting their case. Mm-hmm. And that's what the Menzies era did. They prosecuted their case and they won in the end. And a lot of other battles were won in the end because of that foundation that was created. I'm a treaties process, and because it's bringing Aboriginal culture and the British system that we inherited together as a sovereign nation. So the first part is like what happened in America and in Canada and New Zealand with the treaty process, was that the sovereignty of the state was recognised. Yeah. And so in the United States, because it's a bit of an older history, it goes back to the treaties that originally were about alignment during what they called the French Indian Wars, where they went to the Indian nations and asked them, they said, will you fight with the British, or are you going to fight with the French, or are you going to fight with the Spanish? And all these arrangements come out of that. A lot of them were prior to even setting up the United States and Canada, but they were recognised for that process. And so my thing is it's about ending this battle over sovereignty. And I don't believe the way the states are doing things at the moment, treating all Aboriginals as homogenous society. We are a race, but we are independent, different countries. And so we need, that's the term I use, we need to bring that all together. So under our culture, the only ones who can speak for country are the people of that country. So Bundjalung, for instance, me and all my Bundjalung friends and enemies would get together and have that discussion, but we couldn't do that with the Wiradjuri because they're not our people.
Right.
Yolngu people are very much in advance of that. They've already set up their own assembly, which they work with, and they're very much working with the territory government and the federal government on this issue. They don't have a treaty or anything like that, but it's the way they operate with their traditional society. So my thing is that we need, that's why I say treaties, not treaty.
So with each of the nations, the Indigenous nations,
would come forward and we'd have a structure where they come forward and you have this discussion about the treaty, but the basis of the whole thing is the sovereignty of Australia as a nation. And even though I'm a strong believer, and as I said before, I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a bush lawyer, but I'm a strong believer that our sovereignty is not under question, but I just want these arguments to be finished. And that's where I'm coming from.
But on The Voice, you part company with those pushing for treaties. You don't believe that a voice is the answer to the problems of Indigenous disadvantage in Australia, and you don't think it's appropriate to insert it in our constitution?
Well, we won the argument about equality, and there's thousands of Aboriginal people have moved forward. Even Megan Davis can't argue against that. She's a professor of law at a University of New South Wales, which is based on the British university system, which is colonisation. Yeah, so she can't even argue against that. No one can argue against that. So the issue for us is putting to bed some of these issues. So for The Voice, they always talk about The Voice being the thing that's going to be the panacea for fixing all Aboriginal things. My thing is, the problem is I've been around too long. I know the politics of most of these people and that, but also I'm a businessman and I know how to fix things and do things. So I look at The Voice and I looked about what me and Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott and that when I was there at Chief Advisor was how do you bring people out of poverty and how do you build a future for people? I looked at the global stage and I looked at how you do that. And I found in the last 500 years, the only way you move forward is through education and economic participation. They're the only two things because you've got to have an educated people, and you've got to get kids to school, get an education, go into a career. You've got to get economic participation, which is about a job and business, profitable commercial business. It's no accident that the Western society, and when I talk about Western society, I include the Taiwanese, the Japanese, and the South Koreans and that as well, because they are run on a capitalist society, exactly the same as the rest of us. And you look at all those societies, you see the living standard, you see the educational standard, you see people owning houses and having a healthy lifestyle. There's no accident that the top countries in the world rated by OECD have come through that system.
Yeah.
Even the Communist China realised that they had to change, and Deng built the foundations for modern China today, even though we can argue about the present president and what he's doing with China.
So one of the arguments in favour of The Voice that I thought was quite an attractive one is that there is no table, formalised, established table for Indigenous people to come together with government or parliament or the executive to discuss issues that affect them, and that The Voice would create this table, so to speak. I mean, it seemed to me quite a reasonable suggestion. We've had, obviously, bodies like ATSIC in the past, which were abolished, and one of the arguments in favour of The Voice is, well, we want something that just can't be abolished given the changing nature of political power in the country or whims of politicians and leaders, that The Voice in the Constitution would be there forevermore, and it would be that vehicle through which to have discussions. So, that might be around economic participation, that might be around educational opportunities. but you still think that this is unnecessary or an impediment to those progress in those areas?
It's built on a falsehood.
Right.
That there is no table.
Yeah.
There is a table, and it's been there for decades, for over 50 years. And that table has been the formal type situation where you had ADSIC, and then you had the National Aboriginal Consultative Council, and then the National Aboriginal Conference, and all these bodies that were there. But also there's the individual things which operate as well, like the rest of Australians do. So the Mineral Council lobbies government. Well, there's an Aboriginal health body called NACCHO, and that's what they do. They lobby government over health. We have other bodies like the Pharmaceutical Guild and stuff. They lobby government about the pharmaceutical stuff and health. Well, we have those too in regard to the effort to education, in the National Aboriginal Education Group. So we have those bodies already there at the table. In fact, there's probably 3,000 committees and bodies that sit there, some formally, and the minister has an advisory group that comes through, and the other ones are the informal, which is where NACCHO and NAILS, which is the National Aboriginal Legal Services, they come and lobby government. In fact, when I go to Canberra every now and again, I'm tripping over more blackfellows and getting a poke a stick at. They're there lobbying. And then, of course, currently we have the Coalition of the Peaks, which is made up of Aboriginal community groups, mainly health groups, and they're sitting at the National Cabinet with the premiers and the chief ministers and the prime minister. So we have these bodies. So they make it sound very cute, like the way you put it, that it's nice to have a table where we can all sit around and chat. We do. And this is their words, it's not my words. They say that this is a minimal gesture to do this. But once you have something and they said that the High Court can't make decisions, well, that's any constitutional lawyer, and this is what all of them say, even the yes and no feel, is the High Court, with the wording that's going into the Constitution, the High Court is the arbitrator of truth of the Constitution. And so, of course, people can go to the High Court. You can't stop them from going to the High Court. It's only the High Court will make a decision about each case that comes forward, whether they're going to hear it or not. So this is one of the fallacies of it. And also it's advisory so that government can ignore it. And then they'll argue that, government didn't listen to the previous bodies. Well, if they can ignore this body, what's the difference with this body to the previous bodies? So I just sit there and go, so only difference is that now we're going to be putting it in the Constitution and we're going to be stuck with it. So were we able to get rid of ADSIC? A lot of people talk about ADSIC. I was around the table. I was Vice President of the Labor Party at the time. And it was made quite clear to the ADSIC commissioners that, because these are people have lost their memories in this area, serious allegations were made about rape and corruption. And you can't ignore that. And so on the Labor side, we tried to work with them and say, look, ask these blokes to step aside and let an investigation go through and it'll go where it goes. These things were rejected by the ADSIC commissioners, and therefore the Labor Party sat down with the government. They always say it was Howard. It was a bipartisan thing. But we all sat at that table and, of course, the members of Parliament voted to close it.
Yeah. So, Warren, and the polls are looking like the result will be for no in October or whenever the Prime Minister chooses a date, apparently before the wet season, he just said over the weekend.
Oh, good.
So we have that level of clarity at least. But if no is successful, but there is definitely in the community support for Indigenous recognition in the Constitution and doing better by Indigenous people, right? I think that'd be 90% of people in Australia, and I'm just guessing, but, it's strong.
Polling is near 100%.
So where to from October if no is successful?
Well, it's very simple. It's the first thing I have to do. Let's start with the alphabet. And the first letter of the alphabet is A, and A is accountability. Now, we're spending billions of dollars every year for the last 50 years. And people say nothing's changed. Well, I don't fully agree with that, but there are communities who are really suffering and we can't turn a blind eye to that. And this is what I talk about. I sit there and go, well, the parts I don't agree with is look at what was done with the Turnbull-Abbott government. They put in place a Indigenous business strategy. That Indigenous business strategy today is worth more than $8.7 billion in contracts going out to those businesses. It hardly cost the government a cent because these contracts were going out anyway. State and territory governments have picked up on that, and the wider Australian business community has picked up. Look at the mining industry. There's 7,000 Aboriginals employed in that, plus there's about a $4 billion industry there.
Incredible.
Then you start looking about the whole program. Since 2015, 45,000 Aboriginals have got a job through that process. You got $8.7 billion. Over 3,500, nearly 4,000 Aboriginal businesses have been set up and operating. You've had this incredible boom. And it's really funny because most of those people don't sit around the table. They're doing business. They're employing people. And we know from data that these Aboriginal businesses, 37% of them are in regional and remote Australia, 70% of their employees are Aboriginal. So this is employment, doing real jobs. And I say real jobs because they're working in a commercial, profit-making business. Sounds a bit capitalist there, and it's working. And then you start looking at land reform, because we did this prior to the last election. We tweaked the native title and land rights legislation. So Aboriginal people could own houses on their own land. We had the bizarre situation that some of those 7,000 Aboriginals who worked in the mining industry is on $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 annually, couldn't own a home on their own land. And we know that if your parents own a home, the likelihood is you're going to own a home, your children own a home, and your grandchildren are going to own a home. That is economic opportunities and economic prosperity for those people. That's all been reversed now. But anyway, we'll keep the fight up on that. The other thing is education. We need to get kids to school.
Yeah.
And it goes hand in hand with parents going to work. I didn't have to be told about going to school or work because I saw my mum and dad get up at 5 a.m. in the morning and go to work. So me, that was natural. Yeah. Some of these communities haven't had employment for 4 generations. So I'm like a bloke from Mars turning up and talking about jobs. How do we tweak also those titles so we can get investors going into these communities and building economies and do things? I just wrote a paper in April. It's on the website of the Centre for Independent Studies, looking at a township with a population of 2,000 people. On one side, you got majority Aboriginal, on the other side, you got majority non-Aboriginal. And we said, what's the difference between those two communities? Well, in that non-Aboriginal community, we found a service station. We found a IGA-type style grocery store. We found a hairdresser. We found some of them a pub and accommodation. Well, all of them had accommodation and stuff like that. You went to the Aboriginal side and you found a community store by the government.
Yeah.
And so economic development is key to this whole process. You can't magically, like I talk about the Prime Minister now, he's like he rides up on a mythical unicorn waving a magic wand and he thinks that forming a committee and having people sitting around talking about things is going to make a difference. No, what makes a difference is when you have an Aboriginal community who wants to run a business. That makes a difference.
Well, Warren Mundine, it's an ambitious and exciting agenda and all power to you. And thank you so much for taking all this time to talk to us here at the Robert Menzies Institute about your life, your experiences and what you're really passionate about. It's been a great learning experience for me and I'm sure all our listeners. So thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me here and thanks Robert Menzies Institute.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.